The Lusitania would be the middle ship to her sisters, the R.M.S. Mauretania and the R.M.S. Aquitania. The Lusitania would be built at the John Brown and Company shipyards in Clydebank, Scotland. The shipyard would produce many ships, and among them would be the H.M.S. Hood. She would be owned and operated by the Cunard Line, and her keel would be laid down on August 17th of 1904, designated ship number 367. And she would be launched on June 7th, 1906, and she would be christened by Mary Lady Inverclyde. The ship was delivered to the Cunard Line on August 26th of 1907, and her maiden voyage would be on September 7th. The Lusitania would displace 44,767 tons, and she weighed 31,550 gross registered tons. The ship would be 787 feet long. The beam would be 87 feet, and she would have a height of 65 feet to the boat deck, 165 feet to the aerials, 104 feet from the keel to the top of the boat deck, and 144 feet from the keel to the top of the funnels. The ship's draft would be 33.6 feet, with a depth of 34 feet. The Lusitania had 9 passenger decks, and she had 25 fire tube boilers, 4 direct-acting Parsons steam turbines, which would produce 76,000 horsepower. She would be propelled by 4 triple-blade propellers when launched. These would be upgraded later on to quadruple-blade propellers during her upgrades in 1909. The Lusitania had a crew of 850. Her passenger capacity would be 2,198. This would include 552 in first class, 460 in second class, and 1,186 in third class. On an interesting side note, the Lusitania would be the first British-launched ocean liner that had 4 funnels. Her first captain would be Commodore James Watt. At the time, Lusitania was the largest transatlantic ocean liner ever built. This record would stand until the launch of her sister ship, the R.M.S. Mauretania. It is also worth noting that the Lusitania construction and expenses were subsidized by the British government. This would be that in the event of war, the ship could be converted to an AMC, which would stand for Armed Merchant Cruiser. This meant that Lusitania can be converted to carry troops instead of passengers, and the ship would also be equipped with special compartments for storing guns and ammunition. Her home port would be Liverpool. Her route would primarily be located in the North Atlantic, Liverpool to New York City via Cherbourg, France, and Cork, Ireland. Her maiden voyage would conclude with her arriving in New York City on Friday, September 13th, 1907. The arrival of this magnificent ship drew record crowds as they lined up to get a glimpse of the ship. In October of 1907, she would be awarded the coveted blue ribbon by averaging 24 knots as she crossed the Atlantic. The R.M.S. Lusitania would complete just over 100 round trips. Her service career would total 7 years, 9 months, and she would ultimately lose her blue ribbon status to her sister, the R.M.S. Mauretania. Damage to the ship's bridge would occur later, on January 10th of 1910. En route to New York from Liverpool, Lusitania would encounter a rogue wave. This wave was estimated to be 75 feet high. The huge wave would roll over her bow and crash into the bridge. The resulting damage included broken windows and damage to the forecastle area of the ship. The force of the wave would actually push the bridge section of the ship a few inches back, and this would leave a depression which would not be repairable. Luckily, no injuries would result in the incident. The R.M.S. Lusitania would be upgraded in June of 1908. Her 2 outer propellers would be replaced with propellers with a greater blade pitch, and this would improve her speed and maneuverability. However, it would greatly improve in April of 1909, when all of her propellers would be replaced with four-bladed designed propellers. These propellers were similar to Lusitania's sister ship, the R.M.S. Mauretania. These new propellers would reduce vibration and actually gave the ship 1 knot increase in speed. They would be 6 feet wider than the previous 3 blade propellers, and each would weigh 23 tons. These improvements would lead to Lusitania's record Atlantic crossing. She crossed in 4 days, 11 hours, and 42 minutes, with an average speed of almost 26 knots. Her sister ship Mauretania would ultimately break the record and reclaim the blue ribbon. In fact, Mauretania would hold the blue ribbon until July of 1929. It also should be noted that the lifeboats were added to the ship after an upgrade in 1914. World War I would ignite in 1914. The last 4 terrible years of it would end on November 11th, 1918. In the early part of the war, the United States was attempting to remain neutral. Despite being neutral, the German government actually took out advertisements in American newspapers warning them of the potential danger. They placed notices in 50 different newspapers, in particular the danger to American lives if they were to travel on the R.M.S. Lusitania. The following posting is from the Imperial German Embassy and reads as follows. Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. The German Imperial Embassy, from Washington, D.C., 22nd of April, 1915. In May of 1915, the Lusitania would be on a return part of her route, leaving New York and headed back to Liverpool. She would have approximately 1,962 people on board. The British Admiralty would warn the Lusitania of the dangers of the U-boats in the area. They suggested using zigzag-type courses that would make it more difficult for the submarines to attack. They also suggested that the ship avoid certain areas altogether due to the potential dangers. At the time, Captain William Thomas Turner decided not to follow the recommendations of the zigzag-type course. The course would include the changing of the ship's course every few minutes at different times, so they would prove to be a more difficult target to the submarines. The sinking of the merchant ships by the German U-boats around Ireland at the time gave cause for concern for the safety of the Lusitania and the people traveling aboard her. Eventually, on the afternoon of May 7th, the R.M.S. Lusitania would be attacked by a German submarine. The submarine U-20, commanded by Walter Schweiger, would launch a torpedo that would strike Lusitania's starboard side amidship. The explosion would occur just below the waterline, underneath the ship's wheelhouse. The Lusitania was bound for the Prince's Landing. She would be off to the south coast of Ireland, approximately 11 miles from the old head of Kinsale. After a second explosion from within the ship, the massive vessel would begin to list to the starboard side. In a desperate attempt to launch the lifeboats, the listing of the ship would prove to make it nearly impossible. In the total of 48 lifeboats, only 6 of them would be launched successfully. The huge ship would take 18 minutes to sink. Her massive funnels and her masts were the last to be seen as they slipped below the waves and disappeared. In all, 1,199 people lost their lives on that May afternoon. Surviving crew, passengers, and Irish rescuers would manage to save 764 people. 3 of them would ultimately lose their lives due to injury later on. Of the people lost, 128 were United States citizens. But it wouldn't be until April 4th of 1917 that the United States would officially declare war on Germany. It was later discovered that the R.M.S. Lusitania was carrying ammunition for rifles as well as shells, and this was approximately totaling 173 tons. The Germans had accused the ship of such cargo, which justified their attack on the ship. Today, the Lusitania is lying on her starboard side, just over 300 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, approximately 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale Lighthouse Point. Her coordinates are 51 degrees, 24 minutes, 45 seconds north by 8 degrees, 32 minutes, and 52 seconds west.